Good morning. So that was a great intro and a song. Are we on? It's great to be here. I wanted to say a few things before getting started, and we were going to have a microphone where I could walk around. If that works out, we'll do it. If not, I'll be right here. We have a number of things that we want to do, that I want to do with you today. But first, I want to say that it's great to be here in Nashville. I've done a lot of speaking in my career, and one time I was in Minnesota, and I had been on the road almost every day for that month. And I walked onto the stage, and I said, "So good to be in Wisconsin." And they were very gracious. It's when I appreciate the concept of Minnesota nice, where they welcomed me anyway. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm not making a mistake to say I'm somewhere else. So I am, oh, here we go. Good. All right, do I need to walk away from this mic? Anybody? How's that? Can you hear? All right. Great, thank you. So I come from a Mexican background, and I say that because I always want to begin by, when we're looking at bias, and especially implicit bias, I want to acknowledge that we have many cultures here in our midst. Many cultures, and that we are sitting, all of us are sitting on Native American indigenous land, right? And if we're going to really pay attention to what we're doing in terms of bias, then we want to always acknowledge that we come from different places, but that we are still all part of the same community. So I introduce by saying I come from a Mexican background because that's part of the shoulders I stand on are my ancestors and the people that I come from. Just as that would be true for you, that you stand on the shoulders of the people that you come from. In my case, I came from a background where my grandfather actually fought with Pancho Villa in the revolution in Mexico. Now, when I've said that in audiences where there are other Mexicans in the room, I'm proud of that fact. And I used to feel like I was unique there, that I have a grandfather that fought with Pancho Villa. And then I find out, this could be true here, that every time I said that and I asked other Mexicans in the room, did your grandfather fought with Pancho Villa? Everybody raised their hand. So it seems like I'm not so unique and not so special. But I still ride on the shoulders of revolutionaries. And I bring that into the work that I do because it helps me to keep going. And I ask you to think about your ancestors and to think about whose shoulders you stand on as we go through the work today. Because looking at work of equity and looking at bias means that we come here from other people. And we want to keep that in mind. At least I want to keep that in mind. So a word about where I come from organizationally. I'm not going to go through this much, but I'm with the National Equity Project. We are based in Oakland, California, although our work is all over the country. This says a little bit about what we are about, but I'll just say that our mission is really about transformation, and transformation is really about change. And we believe that we can actually facilitate, be a catalyst to changing the world so that equity actually is a result eventually, that we can have a world around us where we can be together in ways that we haven't yet imagined. So our work is very critical to us, looking at how we work with families that have been historically underserved in education, in health, in growth, in life, all of that. So that's just a little bit about us. So today, as I get some time with you, my goal when I look at implicit bias is to have you think about making something that is invisible visible. something invisible visible. The unconscious is invisible, but we want to make it visible so that we can do something about it. So this is an image of something that comes from a thing called the magic eye. If you're as old as I am, you might remember the magic eye. And it has an image here, and there is an image behind this image. And if you had this in front of you and you learned how to do it where the image would come forward, you would stare at this image and you would move a piece of paper with this image closer to your eyes and closer to your eyes until your eyes blurred, and after a number of seconds, something would go on in your brain and you would actually see what's underneath this. And here's what's underneath this image. Believe it or not, this is what's underneath the image. So our goal here today is to create opportunities where the invisible, which is unconscious or implicit bias, becomes visible. That's our goal here today. I'm very, very excited to talk about implicit bias with you because it is one of the most hopeful pieces of work that I think we've landed on in a very long time. It doesn't help explain everything, but it helps us to understand how does bias get lodged into our brain and how does that affect what we do. And we've known it for a long time. Many of us have known this for a long time, but now we have science telling us that that's the case. We have science that's telling us that's the case, right? We know now that we can actually influence unconsciously, we can influence somebody's unconscious moves to make it visible. There was an experiment that was done with a psychology class a number of years ago. And what the class decided to do is to see if they could influence what the professor did in terms of his teaching. And how they did it is this. Unbeknownst to the professor, they decided that when the professor moved to this part of the room giving the lecture, that everybody in the class would look bored. And then that as the professor moved to this side of the room giving the lecture, people would look engaged and excited. They didn't tell the professor that they were doing this. So when the professor moved over here and they looked bored, he began to make more time over here and more time over here until by the end of the class, he was completely here and never going over there. They were able to influence his behavior unconsciously. So we know through science and biology that we can influence the mind. We can bring the invisible to the visible, and that's what we're going to spend some time doing this today. So as we get into this, the first part I want to do is to have you take a brief look at neuroscience. Any neuroscientists in the room? Oh, good. So we're going to look at neuroscience because we're learning a lot about neuroscience, and here's one of the things that we're learning that has to do with the conscious and the unconscious brain. This image shows an iceberg. And if you think about what's visible above the waterline and what's visible below the waterline, that's what we're talking about. The conscious mind is above, the unconscious mind is below, which means that most of what happens in our working life, in our living life, is below the waterline. So here's the quote: "The unconscious parts of the mind are most of the mind where most of the decisions and many of the impressive acts of thinking take place." Right? Couple of data points. Our brains process 11 million pieces of information a second. So I'm going to let that soak in a minute. 11 million pieces of information a second. Now, how many of you are saying, how did they count that? I don't know. But the neuroscientists counted that. 11 million pieces of information a second our brains process. However, only 40 to 50 of those pieces of information are conscious. What does that mean? We're walking around largely unconscious. That's what that means, right? Our unconscious mind is working overtime. A couple other data points. Our mind, what we've learned is that our mind is a meaning-making machine. That's what these are really talking about. That individual and collectively our unconscious mind helps us make meaning. It takes in data, it sorts it, it patterns it, it categorizes it, all at a very quick speed. I talked about it as at the speed of light. That 11 million bits of information every second is being categorized mostly by our unconscious mind. So our unconscious mind is traveling light speed. Our conscious mind is like taking a slow walk. But we want our unconscious mind to be working because it helps us to survive. Fight, flight, or freeze. How many of you have ever experienced a response that was fight, flight, or freeze? Anybody? If you've experienced it, and everybody in the room has, your unconscious is operating. We want that to be the case. If I'm walking down the pathway in some primitive time, even in today, and I hear a rustling in the bush, right? A sound, something over there. If I'm relying on my conscious mind is saying, wonder what that is. I think I've heard that before. Oh, you know what? I knew somebody that heard that, and they're not here anymore, right? But, I don't know if that, bam, right? I'm gone. So our unconscious mind is important. We're not saying get rid of the unconscious mind. In a minute, we'll be talking about unconscious bias and how that's problematic for us, but we're saying that the unconscious mind is important to us. So I want to do a brief experiment with you to kind of show how our brains work. So this is something that's a participatory activity. That means you participate. And all that you have to do is state the color of the text as it's flashed on the screen, but I want you to do it aloud, together. All right, you ready for that? Just state the color of the text as you see it and do it aloud. Here we go. All right, if this were the ACT or SAT test, you wouldn't have made it into college, right? So what happened, right? Our brains are operating in a certain way. What happened here? What happened was how many of you, when you saw the color and the word match, you were able to quickly say it? You see blue, the word is blue, the color is blue, you do what? Blue, real quickly, right? What happened when the color and the word was not the same? You hesitated, right? It took a little while, right, for you to say that, right? So that's what's going on in our brain. Our brains, why is this the case? Because our brains have been conditioned, have been patterned, our unconscious has categorized and allowed us to quickly say the color and the word when the color and the word match, right? Our brains have been soft-wired to do that. How has that happened? Because we've done it over and over and over and over and over again, or we've seen it or heard it or watched it or something over and over again, so that our brains now just go on automatic until we get tripped up. And then when we get tripped up, we hesitate. It takes a little bit, a lag. It's a lag time for us to get there. So that's one of the ways that our brains work. And if we're going to do anything about unconscious or implicit bias, we have to know that this is what happens, because we're going to have to, in a sense, wire our brain differently. So let's do it again. Now you're all tired now, right? Your head hurts. Right, let's do it again. All right, there you go. All right, so a little bit different, right? A little bit different. What happened there? That's the good news, and we're going to get to the more good news a little later. What this says is that your brain can adapt very quickly, right? You notice that you were able to do it a little faster in terms of when the color and the word didn't match. So we want to pay attention to that we actually have the ability to change our brains. We used to think that our brains stopped developing at a certain age. That's not true. The neuroscientists have now taught us that our brains continue to adapt, continue to develop, and that's the good news, because it means we can change, and we're going to need to change when it comes to this. So this is what's going on. This is the firing of a synapse. It's not a reproductive discussion. That right there is the firing of a synapse. And when that synapse fires, that produces these, I'm calling them things. That's not what their technical name is, right? But it produces this mass of wiring that allows us to say the color and say the word very quickly. If you only had one of these, and we didn't have very many of these when it came to the word and the color being different, right? That's why we couldn't do it so fast. But you fired some synapses that allowed you to already adapt to it. So we're looking for opportunities to have synapses fire differently than they have. That's how we're going to look at this. So this is saying that cells that fire together, wire together. And that's our goal, is to have our brains firing differently so that we are able to wire our brains differently. And how do we do this with the unconscious? The unconscious, we have learned, does not listen to data, does not listen to facts. How many of you have ever been in a debate, an argument trying to prove something with data, and the person you're talking to is just like, I got as much data to show the opposites. Happens all the time, right? That's because the unconscious is what you're talking to. And if you try to give the unconscious data to change its mind, you'll never get anywhere. The unconscious listens to metaphor and story and imagery. And that's what we're going to do, is look at that in order to fire differently. So here's a definition that we're going on with unconscious bias, or implicit bias. We use those interchangeably. Implicit bias is a process of associating stereotypes or attitudes towards categories of people without conscious awareness. That's flat out. It's our unconscious is not aware of the associations, the patterns that we're making, which can result in actions and decisions that are at odds with one's intentions or explicit values. That's key. That's key. At odds with our values. We are making decisions, we are taking actions that are at odds with our values. And that's because our unconscious is what's operating without our conscious awareness. So we're going to try to make that visible so that our intentions and our values match more. Have you heard people in this country lately say, well, I'm just not racist? My response is, okay, but your unconscious is. I'm not going to give you any data that proves that because you won't be listening to that, so let's get to some stories. So here are 3 processes that we're going to quickly go into in this talk to understand unconscious bias, implicit bias. Priming happens, associations happens, and then assumptions happen. So we're going to go with, what's my next slide here? I want you to pay attention to priming for a moment and watch a short clip that kind of gets us to understand a little bit about priming.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? Go! The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
All right, how many of you got the number right and thought you were like all that? Right? How many of you did not see the moonwalking bear the first time it went through? Most of us, right? Why was that? Because we were primed. What we were primed in this example to do? To see the passes from the team in white, right? So that's what we watched, and we missed the moonwalking bear. My partner, who swears she's the most observant person on the planet, and I think she is. I showed this to her, and she insisted that I inserted somehow the moonwalking bear during the video while she was watching it because she didn't see it the first time, right? So even though we are conscious beings, Our unconscious didn't see the moonwalking bear because we were primed to not see it. When it comes to issues around race and other issues, but I'm talking about race in this example, we are primed to see something and not other things. So the media primes us. Here's one data point. African American males make up 29% of the nation's poor, but constitute 62% of the images of the poor in the leading news magazines, and 65% of the images of the poor on the leading network television programs. This is priming happening. It's priming happening. It's teaching our brain something about African American males as we're watching the media, right? Examples in Hollywood are all over the place, how the media primes us with what to think about black and brown people. These are just some images from some movies, right, that show us that there is an association when you see images like this. Associations of violence, associations of crime, associations of gang, association of drugs, associations. So we want to pay attention that we are primed to see this. This is a billboard that is up outside of Los Angeles. A billboard about, one is about Tecate, the beer, and the other is about some kind of creamer, right? But look at the priming that's coming from this. What is the priming? What are we being primed to believe about Latin people, especially about Latin women, when you see a billboard like this? Imagine driving by or walking by or reading this ad, seeing this ad in magazines all the time. So our synapses are firing that says Latins are what? Hot, sexualized, right, in one way, right? And that it's better to have two than one. Now that might be true, but I'm just saying that it's the priming. It's the priming that we're talking about here, right? Priming that plants in our minds, right? So associations are made from the priming. We get primed and then we make associations unconsciously, remember. So messages produce associations. Now let's look at a couple. Right? Associations. What do you associate with Martha Stewart? You know, not necessarily a convicted felon, although we might know that. Or associations with LL Cool J. This is, you can't read this, I'm sure, from back there, so I highlighted it. This is something that was in the newspapers at the time of Katrina. Two different newspaper outlets produced on the same day at the same time this image, where the top image is a dark-skinned person, the bottom image are white people, light-skinned people, and the caption is this: we put in black so that you would know that, a young black man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. That's the caption on the top page. On the bottom part, it said this: two, and we put in white, residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina, right? Associations. One is an association of looting, and the other is an association of finding, right? So again, this is about the priming that leads to associations. Unconsciously, our mind synapses are firing over and over again, right? All right, I'm going to pause on this so that you see this. I hope you can see this image. I want you to look at this. This is a safety ad, American Red Cross, before summertime. Be cool, follow the rules. And if you see, you could see the words not cool, and you could see the words cool associated with arrows next to the different children. So what do you notice about who's cool and who's not cool? Every not cool is pointing to a dark-skinned child. Every cool is pointing to a light skin, right? Safety ad. What is the priming and the associations that is being made? Now, this was 2 years ago, during the summertime. It got produced, taken down within 24 hours. We know why it got taken down, right? The question is, how the heck this happened in the first place, right? You have to ask that. You have to ask that. And if we pay attention to unconscious minds, then we have at least a partial answer. Now, this may have been more unconscious than conscious. I wasn't in the room at the time, but my belief is that there were people in the room whose intentions, right, didn't match their values. I have to believe that there were some people in the room anyway that didn't really see what they were doing or see what they were up to. Maybe there were some that did, but there are some that weren't as well. So we want to pay attention that priming helps us to make associations, and those associations are flooded with bias. So bias kicks in before we're aware, but I would say that would be true for that ad. The building of synapses, image by image, is what plants in our unconscious, and it results in autopilot. So when we start hearing about the treatment, or I would say mistreatment, especially of people of color or youth of color, we see a lot of autopilot is going on. And that autopilot is coming from unconscious patterns and categorizations. So let's get into assumptions. If our mind is sorting and coding and the body is responding, the unconscious assumptions that we make have impact on our decision making, right? So you all are in decision making positions, or you're trying to influence decision. If we don't pay attention to assumptions coming out of our unconscious, then we'll miss an important piece of what can get a dark-skinned hand. That part of the brain didn't light up so much, which meant that they were not having an empathetic response to what they were seeing, right? So biology, science is actually teaching us that something is going on in our brains and our minds that is unconscious. And it is actually producing an association and then an assumption that one hand feels pain and the other one doesn't. Or one hand is more human and the other one is not as human. Right? So when we play that out, we can see in the many things that have happened in this country, and around the world, in fact, but in this country, that we can see that theme of making decisions and doing things that are actually, if we look at it coming from our unconscious, we're doing things that actually have us seeing other people as not quite as human as I am or as we are. And we see that in a lot of ways we'll get into later. A couple of Native American boys, 17 and 19 years old, last spring, went on a college tour. They wanted to go to college. So they went on a college tour. This was in Colorado. They were on the campus going through the college tour, and a mother who was also on the college tour, not their mother, someone else's mother, and I'll say it's a white mother because that matters here because it's where the unconscious comes from, that this white mother called the campus police saying there are kids on this tour who are scary and who don't belong here. And the police responded and came and detained them, not in jail, but detained them apart from the tour until the tour moved on, and then they were so embarrassed they left the tour. What was going on there? What's at play there? That's the question. If we look at the unconscious mind and we look at priming and associations and assumptions, we could see how this could be in the unconscious mind, where you would see somebody who is different than you, and you would go to unconsciously perhaps, they don't belong, and they're dangerous, and there's something wrong with them. Watch this video. Let me stop this. I want you to watch this video and go back here. And as you watch this video, I want you to think about the connection of priming, associations, and assumptions.
You see this and you wonder, did he lose his keys or is he blatantly stealing that bike? In broad daylight, he hammers and then saws on the chain. When that doesn't work, he pulls out an industrial-sized bolt cutter, and when he's asked, he fesses up.
You lost it a lot?
No, not exactly.
But he's not a real thief. Justin Kelly is an actor, and our hidden cameras are rolling.
What happened? Nothing. I can't get through the lock. I mean, I know this is weird, but you wouldn't happen to know whose bike this is, would you? No. All right, good. Thank you.
While the scene troubles Tim Lucas enough to turn around for a second look, he's on a family outing. His wife looks alarmed too, but they both move on.
Colleen, my wife, she's like, he's totally stealing that bike. She was like, call the cops.
It turns out Lucas is a pastor, but our thief's confession is safe with him.
It was odd that somebody had all that equipment.
But you didn't do anything.
No?
That's true.
That's the bottom line.
Lots of people stop and stare. A few even question the actor.
I guess I have to ask, is that your bike?
I guess technically no.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Good luck.
Bye.
When no one tries to stop our thief, he ratchets it up a notch with an electric saw, even putting on a pair of goggles. That finally catches the attention of Arlene Menard and her husband George.
You're not stealing it, right?
No, why? It's not your bike, is it?
I just want to know if it's your bike.
No, it's not my bike, but it's not yours, so what do you care?
But it may be next time.
Well.
It's not yours, I'll just let somebody know.
As Arlene sets off to find help, we decide to clue the couple in on our experiment.
I think most people don't want to get involved in a situation like this, and so they just pass it by.
George is right. In over an hour, about 100 people pass by. Only George and Arlene try to stop him. Some tell us they plan to call the police later. Others say they're scared. Keep moving. This woman and her friends give our thief the benefit of the doubt. When we ask why, Bisa Washington tells us first impressions matter.
I remember thinking young white men don't usually carry burglar tools.
So we all make assumptions, huh?
Yeah.
I'm thinking maybe he works for the park, and our thoughts were if he'd been black or a person of color, the police would have been called in immediately.
We're going to do that experiment with an African-American kid. What do you think is going to happen?
Oh, I think people will be very distressed.
I think someone's going to whip out their cell phone and call the park police.
Will they? We replace our white thief with this young man, Matlock. Remember, both actors dress in a similar way and are about the same age.
Is that your bike?
Nah.
Then what are you cutting the chain for?
Right away. Right away, somebody yelled. Wow.
Within seconds, another person confronts our thief.
Is that your bike?
Technically, it's not, but it's gonna be mine.
More people converge.
Is that on the cell phone? You call the police, he's like stealing somebody's bike.
Are you taking that bike? That's your bike?
No, it's not, sir.
Oh, why are you doing that?
Is this any of y'all bikes? Is this your bike?
It's not, it belongs
No, but whoever's
it is. It belongs to someone.
To who?
Well, not to you.
And sure enough, one man whips out a cell phone to call 911.
Yeah, there's someone taking a bike here.
Our actor triggers more reaction. Some people are even snapping pictures for evidence.
I got you, bud. I got you.
Guy's stealing the bike. Whose bike's over here?
Once everyone moves away, we reset our cameras. And within minutes, another outraged man is yelling.
Are you trying to steal that bike?
Excuse me, sir, but the bike's been here for days. Like, no one's gonna take it.
Well, that's not your bike then.
Yeah,
You can't just come in and take something from somebody.
excuse me, sir. I'm
Okay, I'll just take your tools away then. This yours, sir?
Please, sir, don't touch my stuff, sir. Please, sir, do not touch my
Well,
stuff.
you're touching
please.
somebody else's stuff.
Yeah, all right, but this has been here. Like, who's gonna take it?
Well, that doesn't make it your property.
Technically, it does.
No,
if
it doesn't
if
technically. It's not yours to take.
All right, sir.
When we bring out our cameras, David Robb wants us to go after the thief.
That kid in the red shirt.
He's
says
hacking
this
away at a
has
bike
been
that's
here
not
for
his.
days, and he has a right to take it and steal it. And he's come here with tools, obviously.
You know, sir, my name is John Quinones, and this is part of a TV show called What Would You Do? You were pretty upset.
I was.
It's important that we speak up in these situations.
I think so. It just seemed like the right thing to do.
Everyone insists that justice is colorblind.
Did the race of the culprit have anything to do with it?
Not at all. He could have been any color. It wouldn't have mattered to me.
I think it was taking a bike that wasn't his, not what his color was.
Maybe, but take another look at how people passed right by the white actor,
I need the police department.
but not the black actor. Madlock sits nearby, stunned by what just happened.
These racial stereotypes are infused in all of us. I mean, it's part of our culture. So whether you're black or white, you associate crime with blacks and you associate whites with being good.
Jack DeVidio, psychology professor at Yale University.
Whether we believe it, whether we notice it, whether we acknowledge it, race is affecting what I see, what I think, what I do.
DeVidio says we all seize openings to reassure ourselves that we're not biased.
Lost your key? Yeah, actually I did lose my key.
So when given an opening like this lost key explanation, people may respond kindly. Challenging the actor might come off as racist.
So I get the back, you get the front.
Yeah, good luck to you.
Thank you, sir.
All right. So we want to ask the question, whenever we're paying attention to making the invisible visible, what might be at play here? So I'm asking you, what might be at play here? If we think about priming, associations, and assumptions, what might be in play and how these actors, these two different actors, were treated, right? And if we look at it closely, we have our conscious ideas about what might be at play, but we also have to raise our unconscious mind to the forefront so that we could see what's at play. The question was asked, does race matter? The answer is, science even tells us. We no longer have to pay attention to just people's experience. I could tell you from my experience that race matters, and then you can debate that experience, or you might try to debate that experience. But now we're finding out that science is behind this as well, that race does matter. The treatment of the two different young men, if we look at it from the point of view of the unconscious bias, we could see that the unconscious was at play. Can you see that? The unconscious was at play. Priming, associations, and assumptions actually made a difference in what happened. So I want to tell you a brief story. That's my story. And I'm telling you this story so that with the request that you think about maybe one of your stories about how priming, association, and assumptions have come to play with your interactions at some point in time. So years ago, I was working with high school students. And the program that I was running was one that was about building alliances across race and gender and religion and social class and so on. That was the program. We would take teenagers away, 120 teenagers away to a 7-day summer camp that was focused on the issues of racism and sexism and so on. We weren't riding horses. You know, we were doing work around alliance building, community building, leadership development across race. Well, as adults, we had to train and be trained and train ourselves to really do this program. And that meant mostly examining what was happening with us. Like, where are my biases? What do I need to learn about race, gender, oppression, sexism, heterosexism, and so on? What do I have to learn about that? Examining myself. So we spent a lot of time examining ourselves, right? So that we could do the work with young people. One warm summer day in Oakland, I was driving to lunch, and I came to a signal light. I was the first one at the light, so there's a crosswalk in front of me. There's a school up on the left, a middle school, and these children were walking across the crosswalk, going back and forth. And as my windows were down, it was warm, and as I was waiting, 3 young, 6th graders probably, African-American young boys, were walking across the crosswalk. And as they approached and got closer to my car, and I'm sitting there watching them, one of them looks inside from the crosswalk, looks at me, and he says this, "Go ahead, roll up your windows," yelling it at me. So my response when he said that was not my best facilitator response. And I didn't respond to him outwardly, but inside I was going, you know what? Do you know what I do for a living? Do you know that I was defending, and I was saying, why is he saying that to me? Why is he saying that to me? Right? And I was upset. I was mad at that. And as they started walking further across, they were looking at me. I was staring at them, right? I'm like, yeah, you just go. just, like I was just all upset. And they got by. I started to relax a little bit as they moved by, and I noticed as I got past, and I took a breath, and I was starting to not be so upset anymore, that I noticed that my finger was on the switch to roll up the window at that moment. But I didn't know that at the time. Now, they could not see my hand on the switch, but yet this young man, all these young men knew something was happening, right? The question is, why? And then I thought, oh, I need to quit my job. If I'm having that reaction, I need to quit my job. Because I wasn't understanding what was going on inside of me. What was going on inside of me was that I had been primed to think a certain way about African American young men. What's that priming look like? You know what it looks like. We had some pictures of that. I've been primed, and therefore I've made associations. What were my associations? I better protect myself, fight, flight, or freeze, right? My unconscious was working overtime, but my conscious mind was not. And then I made assumptions that there was something dangerous about them, there was something I'm at risk about, just like in this video, the assumptions were made. So we have to make that visible. Now, by making that visible, my own experience visible, I'm able to do something with it. I'm able to say, all right, I'm not quitting my job. I'm going to find a way to figure out, with the help of others, how I could wire my brain differently so that I'm not having that reaction, my automatic reaction to these young men like that. Now I'll ask you to look at yours. All right, a couple more points, and then I'll be moving towards the end. So I've been talking about the individual, like some of the individual acts that we need to be thinking about in order to address unconscious bias, but John Powell, professor now at UC Berkeley, teaches us that we want to look at implicit bias and its connection to something called structural racialization. Now, all that means is that our society is structured in such a way where the goods and the opportunities are actually racialized. And we actually know this. When you look at, you all will know this, when you look at the educational system, would you say that the outcomes of education are racialized? The answer is yes, right? That when you look at who's doing well and who's not, you will see a pattern, and the pattern has white people that are receiving more of the benefits of education than people of color are receiving benefits of education. Healthcare is racialized. When you look at who has it and who doesn't, who gets treated in a certain way, who doesn't, you could see a pattern of racialization. It's also, when we look at gender, you could see the same kind of patterns, right? So we could see that not only if we were to look at unconscious bias connected to gender, then we could also see evidence that there is implicit bias that connects to the very structures that produce opportunity. So I want you to think about the structures that you work in: education, healthcare, criminal justice. Some of you might be in housing, some of you might be in foster care, those kinds of things. And you can see patterns of racialization in there. And that simply means that the advantages go to one group of people over another group of people. Unearned advantages versus unearned disadvantages. So we want to not just pay attention to the individual, we want to pay attention to the structures that are built around us, because our decisions that come out of our unconscious mind are actually producing these structures. So in order to do that, I want to first take a quick reminder, or have a quick reminder that not only are we having to pay attention to the unconscious or the implicit biases, but we come from a history of explicit bias. Right? And I know I'm in Nashville, and I know that there's history here. And everywhere I would go, there would be history here that shows explicit bias. But in our country, we have a history of explicit bias, and I want to remind us about that. So I'm going to, some images that remind us about explicit bias. Explicitly, there was a time when lunch counters were segregated. And there was a time when, now all of these examples that I'm showing you had tremendous rebellion to them, right? We tried to upset this, and we actually succeeded in many cases. We have something called redlining. These are maps of cities, a couple of cities, that show there's a part when you see the red, that's where the banks decided that they were not going to make loans in those particular neighborhoods, right? And guess what those neighborhoods consist, who was in those neighborhoods, right? Black, brown, and poor were in those neighborhoods. So this was policy. This is structure. If you lived in the area that's outlined in red, you could not get a home loan, which meant you couldn't do what? You couldn't accumulate wealth. That was a major way of accumulating wealth, was by the ownership of homes, right? So structurally, explicit bias was at play. Now, we could say unconscious bias was at play too, but we have a history of explicit bias. Here's a couple of slides, a couple of pictures that show something called miscegenation laws. It was against the law to intermarry. Trevor Noah has written a book about this, coming from his experience in South Africa, right, where he says, I was born a crime. And in South Africa he was. Well, guess what? We had that here. And these laws were in place not only in the 60s and in the 50s and in the 40s, right, but there were some in the 1970s that were still in the books, where it was illegal for people of two different, quote, races to actually mix, right? This is a case that went to the Supreme Court, Loving, I love that it was Loving, the name. Loving versus Virginia in 1967, the Supreme Court ruled that, yeah, you know what, it's all right if you love somebody who's a different race than you, right? So we know that explicitly that this has happened. This is a picture, breaks my heart when I see this sometimes. This is a picture of Native Americans who were ripped from their families and taken to boarding schools. And why was that to happen? Why did that happen? Explicitly, the dominant culture, the culture in power, felt that we needed to take these Native children away from their families so that we could, what they called it was this, and they would say this back in the day, so that we could beat the Indian out of them. And make them what? Make them white. That's why it was done. It was explicit. It wasn't hidden. So we come from a history of doing that. But when we look at today's time, we'll do one example, just because of time. Think about, when you think about Nashville, can you recognize that there are certain neighborhoods that would be labeled as disinvested? In other words, there's not a whole lot of resource in those neighborhoods, and there are other neighborhoods that are high opportunity neighborhoods. Is that true? You can see that, right? So today, we can look at a lot of different examples: housing, education, healthcare, and so on, and we could see that we have areas where structurally, we have a difference in the opportunities that people have in one neighborhood over another. And that is largely because we have segregation still. In fact, there's data that shows segregation is stronger today than ever before. San Francisco, the area where I come from, has one of the highest data points of segregation of any community in the country. Why is that? There has been history that has led to how our neighborhoods are organized, how our neighborhoods are structured, and what goods go to one neighborhood over another. So we want to pay attention to structurally, bias is at play. And if we look at the implicit or unconscious bias, we can begin to see visibly that when you drive through these neighborhoods, that one of the things that's happening is that your bias unconsciously is being reinforced or confirmed about who those people are, right? So you drive through a neighborhood that's disinvested, that has poor roads, that has no grocery outlets, that's full of liquor stores, and so on. What happens in your mind? The association that those people, something wrong with them, gets reconfirmed in your mind if you don't know it's happening. And we don't know what's happening until we do know what's happening. But when you drive through a neighborhood that has high investment, more green, lots of food outlets, restaurants, and so on, your mind also confirms your assumption about those people who live in those neighborhoods. So we can look at structurally wherever we walk in the world, in our schools, when you see who's in trouble in our schools, who's in special ed in our schools, it confirms a bias about who that is. So structurally, we have to do something about structure as well as do something about what's happening individually in our minds. This is just an image of, I put this up here because up above is an image of a professional baseball field, right? And this is an image of the neighborhood that you drive through in order to get to that sport complex. Not in all cities, but in a lot of our cities, this is kind of what it looks like when you're going to a sporting event, a professional sporting event, or a concert or something. You actually have to go through neighborhoods that are disinvested. When you do that, it confirms the unconscious mind and the associations if you don't know it's happening. So we want to pay attention to that. These are schools that look different and are different, and the same thing is going on. So the point here, I'm going to run through this, is that when you look at implicit bias and its connection to structure and its connection to institutions, it makes a difference in a couple of ways, in lots of ways, but I'll just name a few. It makes a difference in who we call back for a job. It makes a difference in length and severity of sentences by judges. It makes a difference in recommendations of surgery or less invasive treatment. And this is all racialized. And with women, one example is doctors discount women's experience of chronic pain as emotional or psychological discomfort, and therefore don't prescribe as much pain medications, right? So we see that the unconscious is not just affecting us on an individual basis, it's affecting us on an institutional or structural basis. And how quickly some people are shot by police. We think the unconscious has an ability to affect that as well. All right, a couple more points and then I'll end. We can't avoid mentally absorbing the categories defined by society in which we live. They permeate the news, television, programming, films, all aspects of our culture. And because our brains naturally categorize, we are vulnerable to acting on the attitudes those categories represent. So that's the summary, that we're vulnerable to it, but we do know that there's something that we can do about that. So here's the good news, and I've said that our brains can adapt. We saw that in the colors and the words experiment, that our brains are malleable. We can become more conscious of bias and how it operates. We have the ability to change what's going on. Marion Diamond, this is a physician, a neuroscientist, that has taught us a lot about how this works. This is actually a picture of her carrying a brain. She was walking around in the hospital, a teaching hospital, teaching people about the brain. I think that's wild, right, to do that in the first place. She's one that has taught us that our brains actually continue to develop. Something called plasticity is happening. Plasticity is when our brains can mold like plastic. That they're not in one place. That if we fire our cells differently, we can actually bring our unconscious mind, we can actually not change what's going on in our mind, we can add new wiring that helps us to act differently. That's the good news about this. So 2 strategies that I want to tell you about. One is called creating new narratives. There are lots of strategies, but one strategy called creating new narratives is a way of wiring our brains differently. So I'm going to do this with you right now. So think about this is an ad from H&M that was put out last summer with one title on the sweatshirt that says "The coolest monkey in the jungle," associated with this young man, this boy, right? Think about the unconscious and what's firing. He was paired next to a white child that had a different label on the sweatshirt that says survival expert, right? So you can see the unconscious associations, right? So if we're going to change the narrative on this, which is what happened to me, this is another one of those, how did that happen? And another one of those where it was taken down in less than 24 hours. And one thing that happened to change the narrative was this. LeBron James, now I'm a Warriors fan, so I'm not so crazy about LeBron James, but I am crazy about him in lots of different ways. LeBron James said, we're not going to let this narrative stay live. So he took to Twitter, and this is what he did on Twitter. He changed it. Yeah. He said they're kings, and he put a crown and covered up what was on the sweatshirt. He changed the narrative. What did this have the possibility to do in our brains? Again, back to neuroscience. It has the possibility of our brains firing differently now. We have a different image. It can produce a pathway that allows us to go to this instead of what went before. So change the narrative. So this is a group of Latinos graduating from college. What's a new narrative we would associate with these young people? A narrative that counters stereotypes. Just think about that. New narrative, scholars, graduates, counters stereotypes. What's a new narrative if you look at these young people in school? What's a new narrative that comes to your mind about this image? They're interested. They're scientists. They're experimenting. They're being creative. I'm saying the narratives. If we had more time, I'd be asking you to gather at your tables and talk about the new narratives. New narratives. New narratives. What's a new narrative about these images here? They like to read, studious, engaged, having fun, interested in education. These are all different messages that we would be planting, firing those synapses differently. New narrative. Now I'm pausing here. Why? This is like the words and the colors, right? Whenever I show this slide, people say, nope, get those pants up. That's not a new narrative. What's a new narrative? The point is this. We have to be able to produce new narratives even if the pants are sagging. We have to be able to do that. So the new narrative is what? Some have said, taking a break, hard workers, fashion forward. The point is we got to produce new narratives. New narratives, what comes to mind? Future leaders, and lots of other things, scholars, intelligence, beauty. So one strategy is to produce new narratives, and we have to figure out more ways to do that. Why? Because it fires off new synapses in our brains that allows us to make different associations than we have planted in our mind. The last strategy, and then I'll close, we want to look at changing the structure. So we have these structural arrangements that we've talked about, and we want to change the structure. I think this began with the Philadelphia Philharmonic Orchestra years ago when the orchestra was all male orchestra. And the question was raised, why don't we have women in this orchestra? And the answer was, guess what? We can't find any qualified women musicians. That was the answer, right? So what did they do? They said, well, we're going to test this out. We don't believe that, and we're going to test this out. There's something wrong here where women are not being put on the orchestra. So they decided to change the structure of how people got on the orchestra, right? The audition process. What did they do? They decided to put a curtain up to block who they were seeing so that they could see if there would be a difference, right? So they did that, and they found after they put the curtain up and they did auditions that things didn't change. It was still all male. They didn't actually produce any women musicians, even with the curtain up. Somebody said, I wonder why that's the case. And they examined their audition practice, and they saw that they were on a stage like this with a wooden floor. You know where I'm going. And the curtain was up, but the musicians had to walk across the floor in order to get in front of the evaluators. And guess what? Yeah, they heard click, 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 click. Then unconsciously, the people knew that was a woman. So what they do, they put a carpet down. Within one time of doing the carpet, 50% more women were accepted onto the orchestra. Why? Because the unconscious mind was interrupted and they began to have a new experience. They changed the structure. They changed the structure. Resumes today. We see that if you have a resume and the people who are doing the hiring see the names on the resume and it's a white-sounding name versus a Latin or a black-sounding name, that the callbacks are 50% less with those who are black or brown-sounding names. We know that's true. Even though the resume is exactly the same. This is the research that was done. Exactly the same. What's the explanation? Unconscious bias is part of what's going on. So we can change the structure. We have the same thing going on in our schools, right? Where if we change the structure and we have high expectations, regardless of who we're seeing, then we see that kids accelerate regardless of who they are. All right, so those are examples of things that we can do. I'm going to ask you simply we don't have time to actually do this, but I want you to think about any of the reflections that you've heard, because if we're going to, again, have our unconscious bias mitigated, we want to be reflecting on your thoughts, questions, insights as to what you're thinking about unconscious bias. So I just have this to plant this seed for you to reflect on the unconscious mind, on your unconscious mind. And I'll leave you with this. Implicit biases come from the culture. I think of them as the thumbprint of the culture on our minds. Human beings have the ability to learn to associate two things together very quickly. That is innate. What we teach ourselves, what we choose to associate, is up to us. So it's up to us. Thank you so much. This is some contact information.